So I'll be talking about deep learning, and this is kind of a uh, continuation of the last lecture on machine learning. So hopefully you remember some of that material, then I'll recap as I go along. So to start with, what we went over last time, I'll just recap the things we covered. We covered some definitions and terminology, what is AI, what is machine learning, and indeed what is deep learning. We talked about the differences between supervised, unsupervised types of learning, about regression versus binary and multi-class classification, uh, machine learning models in general. And we discussed several different models, including linear models, various clustering, dimensionality reduction approaches, and also decision trees. And finally, we went over some machine learning in practice. We did that practical collab notebook, and there we looked at normalization. We talked about different regression and classification metrics, and of course, cross-validation, making sure that your model is indeed generalizing, and of course, the scikit-learn library. Many of these things we'll still be using when we start talking about deep learning, but some things do end up changing. Um, so just again, to recap what deep learning is, it's really just talking about machine learning with an extremely high number of parameters. And we typically tune these by gradient descent, which I'll talk about today, on lots of different data. And some very popular examples of deep learning models are AlphaZero, which achieves superhuman performance in various games, GPT-3, which is somewhat related to like this chat GPT, but in general is a large language model. AlphaFold, which does protein structure prediction. This is really just a supervised model with maybe some additional tricks to make it slightly better, like semi-supervised. And of course, there's DALL-E 2, which takes text descriptions and produces images. So the building block to almost all of these models is the feed-forward neural network. And this architecture is pretty much how most machine learning operates. So the idea really is that you come in with your feature vector X. So this is your data set, and the X1, X2, X3 here are dimensions of your data set. So if you had biological data, maybe RNA sequencing data, these could be the genes, so the measurements you got for each gene. In other types of data, like in a text data, these could be words. So these different words were in the sentence, this type of idea. So all of that comes in, and then you have this fully connected layer to this next layer called the weight vector. And each singular feature is multiplied by the weight vector, and then you add all of the results. And you also add these bias terms. And finally, once you have that, you feed it through a so-called activation function, and you get some output. So what's going on here? This is somewhat inspired by biological networks. So we kind of have this sense that in the brain you have neurons, and those neurons are connected through dendrites to other neurons. And essentially a signal comes in, and you have like some of your neurons will activate to very specific signals, and if there's enough of a signal, it gets passed through, it produces a spike, and that gets cascaded to other neurons. So that you can kind of think of that cascade part as like this activation function, and something that is like doesn't care about it will have a low weight, but something that really cares about that particular signal will have a high weight. So that's kind of how it was inspired, but in practice, it does not work anything really like a biological neuron. One of the primary differences, in fact, early on, we were using these like sigmoid functions at every layer, but nowadays they use this thing called ReLU, which is actually a linear layer. And so it actually does leak information. So even if you connect to neurons and it's not that much uh, like a reaction to the dimension, if you will, it still gets leaked and cascade further down the line. And we don't really believe humans work like that, but nonetheless, that's how that works. And I put this link in, and I'll just click on it and show you. So this is the TensorFlow playground, and you can kind of play with it and figure out what exactly the properties of this type of architecture has. So if we click this, we can see that on the right here, this is the classification output and what you get. So if you remove some things, you can kind of see what exactly happens when you have less hidden layers. You can see it's not as good at learning, and you can also see what happens when you change the activation function. So this ReLU is the one that's used in practice a lot, and you can see it has these like straight edges a lot more than the sigmoid activation function. And certain types of data, if we don't have enough neurons, we're unable to learn it. The other thing is, here we have a classification problem, but you can also have a regression problem. Um, and this really is just changing the activation on the output layer. We talked last time about how you can take a logistic regression function and turn it into a classifier just by adding a sigmoid to the last, like to the output of that um, regression, and then you get a classification. And in fact, you do the same thing for neural networks. So with that, I'll move on. Well, actually, one other thing I'll say about this is, though I have this like network diagram, in general, you would stack this horizontally and vertically. Vertically if you have more dimensions in your data, and horizontally would give you these like downstream features. Abhi, did you have a question?
Yeah. So in this kind of architecture, what would lead to overfitting? More neurons or more layers, or is it more complicated to say? Just those two.
So, so we'll get to that a little later, actually.
Mhm.
But overfitting can be caused by all types of things. Most neural networks are heavily overparameterized,
Mhm.
and generally in machine learning, if you have too many parameters for something, you're going to overfit. But there are some quirks with neural networks which allow it to not overfit in these cases. But in general, overfitting just occurs if actually just memorizing the data is easier than what you want to actually learn. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, hopefully that helps, and hopefully I'll answer it later. Um, yeah, in practice, even though we have this shape, in practice, these architectures will use a matrix multiplication between these vectors. So you have the input vector and the weight vector. And if you do a matrix multiplication, you'll end up getting the same thing. And matrix multiplications are very efficient in GPUs and hardware. So all of these machine learning libraries are really just taking many matrices and doing these matrix multiplications. Um, so, um, so we talked about and we showed this app that just learns these classification boundaries. So how does learning actually work? So it's this thing called gradient descent and backpropagation. So even classic algorithms have techniques to optimize parameters. Linear regression, for instance, in particular, ordinary least squares, which all linear models, for the most part, are using one way or another, has this closed form solution for just two parameters that are necessary to represent what your linear regression is. Your mx plus b and y equals mx plus b. This is the slope and the bias that you learn here. But in neural networks, the architecture may be laid out in very arbitrary ways. And so what is happening is we use this thing called auto differentiation, which is a computational paradigm that just captures all the operations you do to a particular your input vector. So you take your input vector, you multiply it by this, you add that, and it tracks each of these operations. And so then it knows that the derivative of an addition is something, the derivative of a cosine is something else, and it can do chain rules. So it does this. So after tracking all of the operations performed, it can then kind of back propagate and get the derivatives of your function. And when it does that, it can now that it has the derivative, it can do something called gradient descent. And gradient descent is somewhat like what it sounds. So a gradient, if you don't remember, is a derivative in a multivariate setting. And so the gradient descent is just going to find the derivative and try and go downwards. So when we have our model, we predict something and we have this, we know what we want it to be, we know what we got. And so we can find, okay, what's the derivative? And let's make what we predicted be slightly better than what we got. So that's what these algorithms do at a high level. There are several of them. There's stochastic gradient descent, or SGD, and Adigrad. One that is used heavily nowadays is Atom. That's not shown here, but they all work using often physics-inspired properties to kind of follow these loss surfaces. So it's a little abstract, but the ultimate idea is these balls that are going uphill, if you will, are getting worse at the prediction, and the by computing the gradient, we realize they're getting worse, and we apply a force to make them better, and ultimately, eventually, the predictions are getting better and better, and that's kind of what's represented by these balls approaching this local minima. It's important to note that because this is happening on arbitrary architectures, arbitrary problems, not every loss surface is going to be this well designed. It's possible to have multiple local minima and you get caught in those minima. And the way these algorithms are designed to overcome that is by having some sense of momentum. So it's like throwing a ball, and maybe there's a small hill, but hopefully you have enough force to kind of roll over that hill and get into a lower valley, if you will. And there's stochasticity because that's kind of the best way to overcome the unknown is to apply random perturbations and hope that you get it unstuck. And all these algorithms are doing this one way or another. and training some of these very deep neural networks involves helping these algorithms get over these local minima by applying perturbations or making training in a schedule, if you will. At the very start, you'll use very high momentum values. So you move very fast, get over most of the valleys, and then you slowly but surely lower that so to get even closer. Because if it's too high, you can overshoot. So that's that. And if I cover the math, you'll all be yeah. So suffice it to say, these algorithms exist, and all you do is build your architecture. You define your loss function, which depends on whether you're doing classification or regression, and these algorithms go to work.